This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
South Africa rations water to save dwindling supplies. Thousands displaced after Ubangi River burst its banks in the Central African Republic. And research shows that Chinese companies invest in Africa's skill development. Hello and welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. We'll bring you the details on those stories in just a moment, but first, Uche Okoronkwo with the day's business headlines. Uche.
Thank you, Beatrice. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. South Africa at risk of losing its duty-free access to the American market. And the EU agrees to extend the Brexit deadline to January 2020. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. And let's begin with some disturbing news from Burkina Faso. At least 16 people have been killed after militants attacked a village in Pobi Mengao in the northern Sium province. According to witnesses, the gunmen threatened to kidnap children and demanded that the villagers help them buy guns. When they refused, they were shot dead. Authorities suspect militants linked to Al-Qaeda to be behind the attack. The country is one of the Sahel nations battling ISIL and Al-Qaeda insurgencies which have destabilized the region. Let's now go to South Africa, where authorities have imposed emergency measures amid a crippling water shortage. They include supply rationing as the nation battles to save dwindling water supplies. This comes as abnormally hot temperatures continue being felt in a dry summer. The Water Ministry has called upon citizens to use water sparingly and stop unnecessary wastage. Levels in water reservoirs have dropped by between 10 and 60%. It is the worst water crisis to be felt since the 2015 drought. Somalia is one of the several nations battling ISIL militants after the terrorist network established a base there in 2015. Following the death of the ideological leader of the Islamic State in a US-led raid in northwestern Syria, here's CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo on what Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's death means for the future of ISIL in Somalia.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He was the founder and leader of ISIS, the most ruthless and violent terror organization anywhere in the world.
The world's most wanted man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed by US Special Forces over the weekend in a raid on his compound in a small Syrian town. The announcement by US President Donald Trump comes as the militant group is rapidly expanding its foothold in the African continent. Over the years, the group has expanded its operations in more than a dozen countries, including Libya, Egypt, Somalia, and Nigeria. This man is the commander of a pro-ISIL faction in Somalia. Sheikh Abdul Qadir Momin has been leading this group since 2015. The fighters are based in this mountainous region northeast of the country. Regional forces from Puntland have managed to thwart the group's operations, denying it a chance to capture towns and villages in the semi-autonomous region. Baghdadi's death is expected to serve as a major blow to ISIL's operation, but based on past experiences from Al-Qaeda following the killing of Osama bin Laden, experts are concerned that the group will likely overcome this by picking a new leader who will continue with Baghdadi's objectives.
8 years ago, Osama bin Laden was killed, but his death hasn't affected Al-Qaeda's operations. There was only a change in leadership. The question is, who will replace Baghdadi? It's important that the entire network is destroyed, not just an individual at the helm of leadership.
3 ISIL fighters were killed last week in an aerial strike conducted by US military in Somalia. Pentagon has intensified strikes against the group, estimated to have hundreds of fighters. ISIL has targeted government forces and private businesses. Its targets include big corporations from which they impose hefty taxes to help sustain their operations. Government forces have beefed up security across state institutions in fear of reprisal attacks by the pro-ISIL faction following the death of their supreme leader. Meanwhile, a government has been urged to increase its fight against armed groups hoping to turn Somalia into a safe haven for militant organizations. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Well, let's now head to the Central African Republic, where tens of thousands of people in the capital Ubangi have been displaced. This follows 2 days of heavy rains, which led to the local river Ubangi bursting its banks. With more details, here's CGTN's Brian Toussaint.
After 2 days of unusually heavy rains, these residents of Bangui had to move, with some houses crumbling. They are now living in camps for the internally displaced, as the river Ubangi, which cuts through the capital, continues swelling after bursting its banks.
It is really sad and it's a disaster. Water flooded our homes and destroyed all our belongings. The children can't go to school and our food situation is hard. We don't have any shelter, not even plastic to protect us. The government needs to take care of us.
As you can see, it is raining. There are no covers and there is still a great risk because some houses might collapse. So there is still a danger.
Prime Minister Firmin Ingrebada says the government has already declared the situation a national disaster as efforts to distribute humanitarian aid get underway.
The government has been working hard since the start of this catastrophe to help our compatriots who are in distress.
According to the government, around 8,000 people were displaced in the last 2 days. 20,000 more are displaced across the nation. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
The international humanitarian organization Médecins Sans Frontières is now calling on European nations to allow a ship with 104 migrants to dock. The migrants were rescued 10 days ago. The ship has been drifting near Ocean Viking port in Portuguese waters, awaiting clearance to anchor. In a statement, the Médecins Sans Frontières also called on European Union nations to put in place mechanisms that would allow coordinated disembarking for migrant rescue ships. This was part of the issues discussed by EU leaders in Luxembourg earlier this month. Most of the migrants aboard the stranded ship called SOS Mediterranee were rescued off the Libyan coast. They include 2 expectant women and 41 children. To Ethiopia now, where relative calm has returned to the Oromia region after a week of protests that claimed at least 67 lives. Officials say 70 people have been arrested in connection with the unrest. The violence broke out after a high-profile activist accused security forces of trying to orchestrate an attack against him. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has vowed to bring those responsible to justice. CGTN's Girum Chala has more.
In towns like Adama, Ambo and Hararge, where recent clashes and protests were widely seen, things are slowly returning to normalcy. And most cities across Oromia, the largest regional state under the federal government of Ethiopia, are calm. So far, and according to official reports, about 67 people have been killed and hundreds were injured due to the violence triggered after security details of Jawar Muhammad, a prominent Oromo activist and director of OMN TV, are said to be removed by the government. Soon, the situation has turned into both ethnic and religious-based clash, resulting into loss of lives and damage of properties. Police said at least 6 of its members were killed while on duty, and it has arrested 70 people so far. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed promised to bring perpetrators to justice and contain the violence. Still, many fear the situation is fresh and the country is fragile unless a quick and effective plan is laid to avoid any return of clash. Group Tala CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
To Zimbabwe now, where some teachers are working only 2 days a week as they can no longer afford to travel to work due to inflation. Most of these teachers earn around $100 per month, but their earnings has now been eroded by triple-digit inflation. CGTN's Farai Mwakutuya has that story.
Charles Mubwandarikwa is back from work, planning his next lesson, but he's not sure when that will be. He's been reporting for work 2 days a week because he's incapacitated.
The amount that I receive can only cover for about 2 weeks. So I what we have decided to do with other colleagues is to alternate so that some go today, the others go the next day, so that at least we keep the school running. So when you hear the government saying that schools are running smoothly, that's not true. They always, on a particular day, a number of teachers are not there.
Public servants want higher pay to keep up with escalating costs.
I have a small family, right, of myself and my wife and my son. We are renting 3 rooms at an average cost of $100 each, which comes to about $300 a month. The government is paying me slightly over $1,000, that is before deductions. My parents are in my care. I pay their medical aid, I pay their funeral cover, and it wipes out all the money that I'm supposed to earn. My net salary, after the $1,000 has been deposited, after my deductions, I'm left with about $400.
The hard times have forced a tightening of the belts.
We have had to forego some other luxuries. Gas is expensive, electricity is not there. I have bought some firewood so that when the weather is favorable, then we will do some cooking. We are in town. We didn't expect it to be using firewood. We thought that a teacher in town should be better off.
Because the government is trying to exercise fiscal restraint, it's been reluctant to award huge increments to its workforce. The finance minister recently said another pay hike for civil servants is imminent to cushion them from the rising cost of living. However, the news hasn't enthused hard-pressed beneficiaries.
The moment that is announced, the prices are adjusted to perhaps threefold what would be coming. So by the time we receive the salaries, or by the time we are able to get the money, it's already used up, it's already useless.
Civil servants want their wages linked to the US dollar exchange rate, the only way, they say, to get them through these tough times. Farai Makotuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Now, new research suggests that the bad press on Chinese companies based in Africa when it comes to employment practices and working conditions is unfounded. The research carried out by Professor Carlos Oya and his team from the London School of Oriental and African Studies found that Chinese companies invest heavily, just as heavily as other foreign companies, in skill development, competitive wages and employment opportunities. CGTN's Robert Nagila with more details.
At a workshop at the Technical University of Kenya, Divine Bedzra from Ghana and his team are training on a computer numerical machine. 17 teams from across Africa took part in the annual Africa Tech Challenge sponsored by Chinese firm AVIC. The winners received cash prizes, scholarships and employment opportunities in Chinese companies. A recent study on employment practices and working conditions in Chinese companies in Africa suggests some of the bad press they've received is undeserved. The study, by Professor Carlos Oya and colleagues from the London School of Oriental and African Studies, conducted over a 4-year period in Ethiopia and Angola, found that Chinese companies hired more local workers than previously thought.
Workforce localization is much higher than usually assumed. That means that there is a higher proportion of African workers in the total workforce of these Chinese firms.
Take Kenya, for example. A recent report found that Chinese companies created 50,000 jobs in the country in 2018. There are 106 Chinese companies operating in Kenya with a local workforce of 95%. Professor Oya's research also found that Chinese companies contributed to training and skill development of locals as much as other foreign firms in their sectors.
A general perception is that Chinese firms in these sectors have not been contributing very much to training in different forms, partly because of the assumption that they were hiring a lot of Chinese expat labor. What we find is that precisely because actually a lot of African workers have been employed by these firms in these sectors, and these sectors basically require a substantial skill development for them to actually operate and to make any profits. We find that training patterns are actually not that different between Chinese firms and other comparative firms in the same sector.
Nowhere is this more apparent than in Kenya's flagship standard gauge railway project. Built and funded by China at a cost of $4 billion, it is operated by Afrista, a Chinese company, training locals to take over operations.
At the beginning of 2017, the company organized a training in China. We went to Xi'an province, a little town called Baoji, where we had a training for like 3 months. We learned again the basics and the practicals.
The research also found that there were no significant differences in wages between Chinese companies and other foreign firms. And while there were some issues with a small percentage of companies, the majority aligned employment practices with local labor laws. At least 1,500 workers took part in the survey. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari is due to take part in the 3rd edition of the Future Investment Initiative organized by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. The summit will take place between the 29th and the 31st of October in Riyadh. The conference is expected to focus on sustainable future, technology for good and advanced society. CGTN's Deji Badmos gives us more on that story.
President Buhari had only just returned from a similar trip in Russia, where he attended the Africa-Russia summit in Sochi. But really, these trips are centered on bolstering bilateral ties and wooing investors into the country, something Nigeria badly needs at the moment. For instance, data shows that the total value of capital inflow into Nigeria increased from $12 billion in the first half of 2018 to $14 billion under the same period in 2019. So the whole essence of the visit, as we understand, is to build upon this momentum. Now, during the 3-day event in Saudi Arabia, the president is expected to speak about the economic opportunities that abound in Nigeria and, most importantly, try to leverage on the resources in Saudi's Public Investment Fund, which is, of course, the organizer of the event, to seek foreign investments in critical projects in the country's oil and gas sector. You'll also recall that earlier this year, Saudi Aramco expressed readiness to invest in Nigeria's liquefied natural gas. So definitely, this is also expected to form part of crucial discussions at the summit. And that might have informed why the country's Minister of State for Petroleum Resources and the Group Managing Director of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, are also part of the president's entourage for this trip. So hopefully, the country could see more investments and renewed partnership as an aftermath of this official trip. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. President Sisi of Egypt extends a state of emergency by 3 months. And South Africa's retirement industry witnessing a boom.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Conflicts in Africa remain a source of concern because vulnerable groups are often caught in the crossfire. CGTN's Patrick Oyet now brings us a report on how South Sudanese women and children have been bearing the brunt of a 5-year armed conflict in the country.
Nyajama Wagugi is a mother of 5. She has lived in this camp for internally displaced people for the past 5 years.
Life is difficult because we have no economic activities that we are doing here. We had our farm where we could cultivate, but with the war now, we just have to be here returning home, meaning surrendering to the armed men to be killed.
Nyajama's husband left the camp 2 years ago to try and look for food and never returned. She is now worried that her husband could be dead, and many here are also in mourning.
If you look around, you will not miss a woman who is wearing white dress or white or black dress, because she lost her son, she lost her husband, she lost her house. We are being displaced.
South Sudan's peace deal dictates that a unity government must be formed in November, but the opposition group led by Vice President designate Riek Machar wants that date pushed back to enable the parties to complete reforms of the security sector. South Sudan's government, led by President Salva Kiir, says it is committed to bringing back peace to the country and allowing the displaced people to leave the protection of civilian camps known as POC.
Our view is that there is a need for the formation of the government, or the revitalized government of national unity, coming the 12th of November. Because when you look at it, if Riek comes here, I think anybody in the POC will come out, because most of them are his supporters.
The war has triggered acute food shortages, with thousands of children suffering from malnourishment. The ceasefire signed between the government and the main opposition groups here may be holding for now, but there is a fear among many here that other armed groups that are not a party to the current agreement could continue fighting. The majority of those who will be affected would be children and women like Nyajama. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
South Africa's retirement industry is witnessing a boom, with the number of large-scale retirement properties under development. Independent living solutions are a new trend that is fast surpassing the traditional retirement home. CGTN's Travers Andrews has more.
South Africa's elderly may not be as active in the economy as they once were, but they continue to play an important role in many communities. In Cape Town, a new trend is emerging, one that means more doctors, more amenities, and more services, as a new boutique approach to retirement through independent living takes shape.
The new move afoot is to build age-friendly cities and age-friendly environments, to say this is an environment that is particularly geared for older persons, but not only for older persons, because if we do make the current environment where we're living age-friendly, then we're making it friendly for many different groups, people who have got any form of disability, women, children, etc.
By providing highly accessible urbanized apartments to older persons, property developers are catering to a market that is evolving, one where modern retirement developments are surrounded by a host of services, including access to healthcare and wellness, which can have a significant effect on aging.
In a community like Sea Point, where we have about 16% of the people are over the age of 60, may even be higher at this point. You know, there are many apartments that people live in over here. People have lived here for a long time. There are a lot of services that are available and geared towards older persons.
Developers such as Block and Evergreen Lifestyle are just some of the early investors who are betting big that retiree developments are huge money spinners. Independent living developments are going up at an astonishing rate, especially here along the Atlantic seaboard, where retirees not only have great access to amenities, but more importantly, great access to specialist medical facilities, which is showing huge market demand.
What you find is high quality luxury retirement homes. There's not enough of them in the country. We're seeing suddenly this massive demand being created, and there's actually no real supply. And the major gap is that people typically would retire to very small towns or into winelands areas. They're suddenly looking to retire quite a lot closer to home.
And with new apartments going up to cater for the underserviced retirement market, the face of the property industry does seem to be slowly changing to be a better reflection of the true demographics of the area. Davis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
Meanwhile, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has declared a nationwide state of emergency for another 3 months. Since 2013, Cairo has been working to eradicate terrorist groups, especially in the restive North Sinai region. CGTN's Adel Mahroui has more.
On Saturday, the Egyptian president declared that the nation needs to impose another 3 months of emergency state. Since the deadly churches bomb attack in April 2017, the emergency state has been imposed.
Legally, this is not a direct continuation of the state of emergency, so it cannot be called an extension and doesn't need a referendum. It has become routine for Egypt to do so to maintain its continuity. The parliament still must approve first.
That declaration clearly indicates that Egypt still sees threats to its stability.
After a long period of calm, almost reaching 100%, especially in Sinai, we have returned once again to witnessing terrorist attacks that appear organized. Regional threats are expanding. Even those attacks that the authorities stop before happening are an indication that the fight against terrorism is far from over.
The state of emergency law gives the authorities the right to arrest and search without prior judicial permission, which the government says is essential to engage with suspects on the spot.
Critics warn that such powers could affect personal rights. The government, however, always rejects these claims. This is the 10th extension of the emergency state, and most probably it will not be the last. Since 2017, this exceptional state of law has become the norm for Egyptians. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
And turning now to the investigation into the deaths of 39 people whose bodies were found in the container of a truck in the southeast of England. British authorities have sent records to Vietnam of 4 of the victims to have their identities verified. Our correspondent Richard Bestick has more.
Today, one of the individuals involved in this case appeared in the magistrates' court here in Chelmsford. Maurice John Robinson, 25-year-old lorry driver from Armagh in Ireland, facing 39 charges of manslaughter, conspiracy to traffic people, assisting unlawful immigration and money laundering. He wasn't required to submit a plea. The case has now been referred to the Old Bailey Central Criminal Court in London for the new year. 4 others have been arrested in connection with the case, 3 of them since released on bail until the first 2 weeks of November. The 5th individual is being held in Dublin by the Irish police. Essex police say he is a person of interest in this case. According to the Belgian prosecutor's office, he's being questioned about a container truck he was driving in Belgium and any possible links it might have to the vehicle that carried the 39 victims to the port of Zeebrugge for loading to the UK. It's thought likely now that Essex police will apply for an extradition.
The King of Belgium has named Sophie Wilmès as interim Prime Minister, making her the first woman to hold the post. She replaces Charles Michel, who is set to take over from Donald Tusk as European Council President in December. Wilmès has served as Belgium's budget minister since 2015. She will lead a caretaker government until the country's political parties can agree on forming a coalition. Belgium has not had a full federal government since December 2018, when a coalition led by the outgoing prime minister collapsed. Well, let's now go to Uche Okoronkwo for a look at the latest business news. Uche.
Thanks, Beatrice. And coming up on AfricaLive Biz. South Africa at risk of losing duty-free access to the US market. And the EU agrees to extend the Brexit deadline to January 2020.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's start off in South Africa. The country is at risk of losing its duty-free access to the U.S. market. Exports worth some $2.4 billion are under threat from a review by the U.S. Office of Trade Representatives. Now, the review has been triggered by complaints from American companies around South Africa's failure to reform the local copyright system. Now, if the appeal succeeds, South Africa will also lose its status on the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The deal allows most sub-Saharan African states duty-free access to the U.S. market. President Donald Trump's administration has repeatedly used trade tariffs as a weapon. Now, and South Africa has been collateral damage in some of its battles, with the automotive, steel and the aluminium industries being affected. Well, let's shift focus now to Brexit. The European Union has agreed to extend the Brexit deadline until January 31st next year. According to the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, the bloc is allowing for a so-called flex tension. Now, this means that Britain could leave before the October 31st deadline if a deal was approved by UK's Parliament. The EU's decision comes on the same day that British lawmakers decide on the best way to end the current Brexit deadlock. More than 3 years since voting to leave the European Union, the British Parliament remains divided over how, when and whether to leave the bloc. Meanwhile, British lawmakers are expected to vote on Boris Johnson's bid for a December 12th general election. The Prime Minister says he will restart moves to get his Brexit deal bill into law if the motion is passed. From London, here's CGTN's Naweed Jabrakil.
You know what they say, if at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. Boris Johnson will do just that when he attempts to win support for a general election for a third time here in Parliament. We're expecting that to happen on Monday, and he's pushing for an election on December 12th. But he'll need 2/3 of the 650 lawmakers in the Commons to back his plans for it to go through, and it seems some smaller parties may be warming to the idea of a poll. Scotland's SNP, as well as the Liberal Democrats, have written a letter to the EU saying they'll back a poll on an earlier date on December 9th, but only if Britain and the EU agree to extend the current Brexit deadline from the end of this month to the end of January 2020. That's something that the Prime Minister has ruled out. But this really is a numbers game. If he is to get a 2/3 majority, he's probably going to have to rely on the support of the major party in opposition, the Labour Party, which has said it won't back an election unless a no-deal Brexit or Britain crashing out of the European Union is taken completely off the table. So plenty to potentially watch out for in the coming days, and it could be a crunch week for Brexit, but the sense you get is that we've been here before, so don't expect too much clarity on when Britain's going to leave the European Union. Naweed Jabrakil, CGTN, London.
And heading back to the continent now, Tanzania's national carrier has acquired the second Boeing 7878 Dreamliner. Now, Air Tanzania is looking to double the size of its fleet to 14 planes by 2022. The arrival of the plane brings the number of new aircraft purchased by Air Tanzania to 7. The airline currently controls just over 70% of the country's domestic air travel market. However, the carrier is exploring new routes and code-sharing agreements with other airlines. Air Tanzania currently operates regular flights to Zimbabwe, Burundi, Uganda, as well as the Comoros. Now, the state-owned carrier aims at being one of the continent's biggest airlines by 2025. And staying with airline matters, South Africa has allowed Zimbabwe's national airline to fly into Johannesburg. The state-owned Air Zimbabwe was banned from using South African airports over unpaid fees. Well, last week, the airline's only serviceable plane was detained at the OR Tambo International Airport. As a result, the cash-strapped carrier had to cancel its Harare-Johannesburg flight, leaving passengers stranded. Air Zimbabwe has, over the years, had its aircraft seized by creditors. It's amongst dozens of state-owned firms that are set to be partially or fully privatized as, of course, the country seeks to cut its fiscal deficit. And heading to Egypt now, the country is reviewing plans to seek an additional loan facility from the IMF by the end of March 2020. That's according to the country's finance minister, Mohamed Malt. He says that Egypt is committed to implementing reforms to drive growth. The commitment includes pressing ahead with the IPOs of several state-owned companies. At the moment, Egyptian authorities and the Washington-based lender are in talks on the next round of key reforms, which are aimed at boosting economic growth. Of course, Egypt did sign a $12 billion extended fund facility with the fund in 2016. The reform agenda, which expires next month, helped end a major dollar shortage as well as pulled the country out of an economic crisis. And elsewhere, the China Development Bank has signed a $629 million loan agreement with Nigeria. The loan will help finance Africa's biggest oil producer's first deep sea port in the commercial capital of Lagos. Now, the facility is being built by Singapore-based developer, the Tolaram Group, and state-owned construction firm, China Harbour Engineering Company. Once completed, the multi-purpose port will cover an area of about 90 hectares with 3 container berths. It is also projected to generate over 200,000 jobs and about $350 billion in revenue, which of course is a major boost to Nigeria's economy.
What we're trying to do is to stimulate the economic growth, of that zone, and also provide an alternative to Apapa encampment. And it's going to be the deepest seaport in the whole of Nigeria.
Nigeria will have a very modernized, completely new port. And this port will improve the infrastructure of Nigeria. And in the meantime, will provide the basic infrastructure facilities to attract more and more other potential investors and also create job opportunity for the local community.
And heading back to South Africa now, the Cape Town International Airport is forging ahead with an ambitious new infrastructure project. The $460 million expansion program will increase the South African airport's capacity for both domestic and international arrivals. It will also tap into the growing global outbound travel market. With more on this, here's CGTN's Travis Andrews.
Cape Town International Airport may have been crowned the best airport in Africa for the last 3 years, but it's not content with just accolades. It's on an aggressive expansion program to make it the world's best. The airport is about to undergo a more than $460 million expansion upgrade that will see it increase its capacity for both domestic and international arrivals, with a particular focus being placed on being a hub for long-haul travel.
There is an opportunity for what often is referred to South-South, where you start linking the East with the Southern Americas, for example, and that is an opportunity. But we've got a big market already to play on where we go direct routes.
15 new routes and 20 expanded routes make the airport a particularly profitable asset for Airports Company South Africa. which is why such a significant investment was easy to pass muster. The one-way realignment set for 2020 construction means the airport can finally accept much larger aircraft, such as the Airbus A380, which will bring more tourists with more additional spend.
This airport will gain a lot of additional capacity, so the additional flight routes access will be able to boost both trade as well as tourism. Not only in terms of your normal passenger numbers, we're also looking at cargo, logistics. So anything trade related will push, so the timing is absolutely perfect.
The expansion will also increase the airport's capacity after international arrivals increased by 9% for 2019. And China remains one of the top long-haul markets where AXA is keen to push through increased direct connectivity.
That is an absolute key market. We already see relatively good connectivity. There is all the reason in the world for us to vie for a direct connection between Cape Town and China. We would love to see that coming to fruition. It's a key market for us.
Cape Town International Airport's success can also be attributed to its association with the Air Access Initiative, which seeks to boost more inbound flights into the mother city. And with Cathay Pacific already providing connectivity to China, the airport remains on track to forge ahead with its South-South ambitions, which will place Cape Town a lot closer to the beating pulse of international long-haul travel. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
Meanwhile, Tunisia has moved up 2 spots in the World Bank's 2020 Doing Business report. It's now ranked as 78th. Now, the Doing Business 2020 assesses the business environment in about 190 countries. It also looks at the rules affecting a business from inception, as CGTN's Adnan Shaushi tells us.
The finance minister said that the report has a direct positive impact on Tunisia's national economy, boosting investment nationwide and creating wealth.
Tunisia has advanced 2 positions in the World Bank's Doing Business report. This is a very positive indicator. The competition is very fierce with other countries. The report encourages foreign investments, creates jobs, and increases the reserve in foreign exchange.
Tunisia, which has maintained an upward trend for the 2nd consecutive year, is this year behind Morocco, 53rd, which is in the forefront at the Maghreb level in matters of business climate.
The Tunisian government's structural economic reform project kicked off 4 years ago. The results are considerable, but challenges are still ahead. Attracting foreign direct investment and private investment requires more incentives in order to carry on with several planned development projects.
The North African state is followed by Egypt 114th and Algeria 157th, according to the World Bank's annual report that measures the ease of doing business.
The report indicates that between 2017 and 2020, many projects were implemented, like the digitization and transparency of the administration, connecting the fiscal departments to the municipality of Tunis, which boosted tax revenues, as well as the increase in import and exports.
The Doing Business 2020 is the 17th edition of a report that takes into account 190 economies. It assesses the business climate, notably the regulation contributing or impeding the business of enterprises since their creation.
Economists have urged the 217 MPs who have been elected to the House of the People's Representatives and the next government to meet some of the economic recovery targets in the first year in office, so as to maintain an advanced position in the Doing Business report on the African and international levels. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Well, that's all for now on Africa Live Biz. But coming up on Global Business Africa, armed gangs prey on gold processing plants in the country. We'll have the latest updates from Johannesburg. Of course, all that coming up top of the hour. For now, back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's ahead. South African budding artist uses his work to invoke emotional reactions. in South Africa, Cromwell Ngobeni is an artist whose work invokes emotional reactions. Ngobeni portrays human figures on open spaces. Sijutienzo Lisanjamela brings us his story.
Cromwell Ngobeni's art is influenced by the way he was raised. He grew up with so much violence around him. This, he says, became a huge challenge in his life. He portrays this in his work. Ngobeni uses his work as catharsis and as well as raising awareness.
So my work portrays the story of where I'm from and who I am. And then what I can say is that I used to be bullied when I was a kid, and then I had to fight back just to protect myself. So by fighting back, I became a bully as well. So it's more like being a victim and a perpetrator.
Cromwell uses dark, expressive lines to depict his intense emotional feelings. He contrasts the lines with strong tonal values.
What I can say is 2014, my sister was passed on, and then she was a victim of abuse. So me trying to break the cycle of what's happening. So I've tried to put that on paper instead of chasing the guy or searching for the guy, and just to pay revenge and all that. So so what I can say is that I look on what's happening and then also how I feel at that time, so then put it on the paper. So that's what I normally do. So I use human figure to tell a story, and then in different emotions. And then I use a kid a lot. So the kid it represents myself as an artist.
The artist uses a variety of tools to illustrate his art.
I use charcoal, and then I use pastels, and then besides that, I'm a printmaker. So I use lino cut, etching, and monotypes to tell the story of everything.
So I asked him how he discovered that he has this kind of talent.
Okay, for me that's interesting. I can say it's different from other artists. So I have a brother, his name is Sitfree. I'm a Blanet, that's how they call him. So, and a cousin, his name is Tlandla. So those two gentlemen, they're the one that got my interest into art. So they used to draw a lot. I used to carry my brother's sketch pad to school while I was in grade 3. So, and then he used to have a lot of commissions, and then I've tried to fit myself in and then start drawing. So one day I remember I have done the portrait about Dukulu from TKZ, and he said, "Who did this?" And I said, "I did this." He said, "Wow, this is great. You'll now going to help me with my commissions." And then that's why everything started.
Cromwell Ngobeni's only wish now is to have his work to be spread far and wide. Yodison Jamela for CTTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, let's now take a look at your sports news. Here's what's ahead. Egypt's Football Association suspends the Egypt Premier League until the end of November.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
The Egyptian Football Association has decided